Okay, let's get started. So Benji missed last week, so who wants to take some time, and when I say who, I mean all of you, to kind of fill him in on what we discussed. Before we got to the main part of the history lesson, we had a discussion about, or I asked you guys a question. Maybe one of you can ask Benji the question and he can answer it for us. It's only a week ago. You guys are young. You should be able to memorize.
Was it the question you asked about like how we study?
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. So he asked us, how did we go about studying or reading the history in Judaism, or in general, how do we go about studying
And learning and engaging in the process of learning.
And you're asking me, how do we do that?
Yes, we're excited to know.
By having the right heart.
What does that look like for you?
We're asking like physically, how do you do it?
Being respectful, being engaging, desiring to want to learn more.
Okay.
Really know what you're reading. Try to dig a little deeper than just surface.
So how do you dig a little deeper? What are give us some practical things that you do to dig a little deeper?
Well, I'll read over a topic and sometimes I'll just kind of watch some videos or read some different articles about the topic to get some different, a little bit more context around the initial point. That's one thing I do. Another thing I do is sometimes I'll listen to audiobooks. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Good.
Yeah.
I appreciate that answer because ultimately what we were talking about is as we're engaging in anything that we do, particularly in history, what's often more important is, you kind of alluded to it, is the heart behind it and how we actually go about wanting to process information, whether we actually desire to learn the topic or whether we don't, like being honest with ourselves, and then how do we search information out. But one of the things that I pointed out last week and want to just clarify and point out for you too, I think as we are engaging in particular in our group and particularly in our midst, is that we are allowing the Holy Spirit to guide us in our studies as well. I think sometimes it can be very easy to think of, when we read the Bible, that's something we want to be mindful about, or we think in terms of the Holy Spirit. But oftentimes, just in learning in general, we may not invite the wisdom of the Lord to come into that. Because again, the author has a very distinct viewpoint and a worldview, and we can have some insights maybe into who he is and what he thinks based on some things that he writes. But ultimately, if we're going to be most productive in our conversations here, particularly around ancient Egypt, we want to be engaging with the Holy Spirit as things are brought up. Because our hope is that we're not just engaging in this topic of conversation, right, for the sake of learning facts about Egypt, but learning about the culture, how that culture was shaped. And Egypt, biblically speaking, represents the world and the worldly culture on the worldly way. So we're making here really a study, an observation of the wrong way to live. And so how we took the constitutional study was kind of, how do we frame a culture in the right way? This in a lot of ways will be, how do we destroy culture pretty quickly? And interestingly enough, the Egyptian culture spanned thousands of years. It was a really stable, for the most part, culture. And they weren't doing things in a healthy way. And so it was easy for us to see why the culture lasted, because it was built upon power and control and all of those things, that in the worst sense of things. And so let us continue as we engage in this process to be mindful. So for those of you who were here last week, I gave you kind of the encouragement maybe to go back and review. Did anyone go back, review, read again, or take a different approach? Or did we just say, you know what, I did it once, I'm busy?
I read over a little bit.
Did anything stand out to you the second time that you went through?
Second time going through, I kind of took the approach of looking at it from the differences from now and then. There's just, it seems, in a way, what I took from it is like, it seems like there's a lot of things, maybe just in ancient ways of rulership in general, that like we have fallen short of now, and then there's things that they didn't grasp that we have now. But I feel like there's stuff important that are missing from both sides. One of the main, one of them is like from back then. I think we now miss or have lost, like, seems like we've lost honor in our, or at least in America, we've lost an honoring system of like, and respect for this, each person we interact with, or just like people in general. I feel like there's a respect and honor that's been lost through, in a lot of ways, through the way people live and like rights and things. I feel like that's one of the main differences I saw. And then obviously older civilizations just like miss a lot of, didn't grasp a lot of modern things that we have now, which is obviously that they didn't have them because they were, it's like old, but they still had some pretty insane technology, like especially ancient Egypt, for instance, how the pyramids were built. It's just like a huge mystery. Like some people believe giants, some people believe angels from heaven actually came down to earth and showed people how to do those things because of how perfectly three pyramids are aligned with the sun. And some people believe aliens built them, but I mean, there's a lot of different stuff, but yeah.
Good. All right. So thank you for that. Let's follow up. Anyone else want to share with Benji some insights that we learned or that stood out last week as we discussed things?
That we were looking at the culture of Egypt and the way that it could affect either our culture or a way that we can reflect and make our culture better from reflecting off the history. Right, that's what I got out of it.
Can you give some specifics maybe of things that they did that they stood for that we learned last week?
Well, they kind of looked through life through the wrong lens in a way, because they believed in different gods. Like at first there was one, and then there was 10, and then there was however many. I don't even remember how many they have. But it was just the way they did stuff, how they thought you had an afterlife, so they would kill your servants to go with you and your pet, so you'd have a friend there. So that was pretty funny. And just the way they thought that you had to have everything with you, and how we reflected on how those kings took everything with them, but when we look at Jesus' tomb, it was left empty, which we thought that was pretty interesting.
Other thoughts, Esther? You took diligent notes, so.
I didn't take much from the talking, but this is all the question stuff. We were talking about how the Nile was where first Egypt was built around, and how they believed that it was where life became, and that the Nile could give life and take away life. And we talked about stuff in that, and then also the coexistence of opposites, which was an Egyptian mindset, that it was like just the difference of the deserts and the floodplain, and just the two differences and opposites. And then, yeah, like Kayla said, we were talking about the gods and stuff, and how thought they had afterlives, which is interesting. But, I don't know, guys.
Just similar to what they were saying. Just like their perspective is really what I got out of it. It's just, it was really a wrong perspective. And I forgot what you said about the afterlife thing. But just how they weren't living life. They were living life to better themselves in a place that they thought was better, but really, our purpose is different on earth, and God has a purpose for us here for a reason, but just their perspectives were how wrong they were, is what I got out of it last time.
Good. Noah, any thoughts?
One of my favorite things that we covered last week, and as was kind of a part of the reading, was just the idea of, especially in the beginnings of ancient Egypt civilization, there was this idea of, or this prevailing theme of duality. You know what that means? It's kind of like this, like a coexistence of two different things that are inherently separate from one another. So like in the page he gives us here, Justin had us look at the belief at the coexistence of opposites. So I think Esther mentioned a little bit too, where you had the Nile River being the source of both life and death. And so, and maybe in some ways it was also the origination of chaos and order, which are two different, very different things, but they exist together at the same time. And you also had like some, I don't remember the names of these exact areas, I think introduced in chapter 1, but you had lands, even geographical places that were hostile to life and also life-giving. So obviously that usually had to do with the distance that those lands were from the Nile, which was what the Egyptians considered to be the source of life. Along those lines, we looked at one of the first ancient Egyptian deities. I think it was the God Nun, which was the god that kind of created life out of the watery chaos, which obviously is a picture of the Nile again. So we looked a lot at how the Nile is like this super, super important aspect of Egyptian culture and society and civilization. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting too to look at how the Egyptian deities are really, really important in understanding how the Egyptians thought, obviously, because it was obviously their religion, but at the same time, it as religions often do, it very much formed their worldview of things. I'd have to spend a little more time reflection to recall more of the importance of this duality in ancient Egyptian culture, but that was another really interesting and important thing that we covered last time. So, yeah.
Good. Well, thank you guys. Yeah, so to set the tone, and we'll continue this conversation here in the last few chapters, and then give room and time as well for just observations of what we read. Because one of the things, Benji, that I really want to impress upon all of you is that I've given you an outline, and I did email out the outline for next week to you guys. Is not some rigid assignment that has to be followed. But if we are following the inspiration of the Spirit, that we engage in these conversations as kind of a starting point for dialogue. But if you feel or sense the Spirit of God is highlighting something, certainly take time to discuss that and maybe come prepared in the class to even offer a question for discussion. Because, again, the goal of this, our learning together, is not for you guys to memorize things that I've questioned so that you can regurgitate them back. And part of one of the important aspects of learning is to use discernment. How do we process this information, particularly in light of our own worldview? Because we don't share a worldview with the world, we filter it through a biblical perspective. And so we want to make sure that we are engaging our studies in that way. And so following up kind of on what Noah was talking about, and a few of you had mentioned, It's really important for us to fully grasp the Egyptian mindset by going back to the beginning. The God of Nun, who is the God of water. And really was in that understanding that we see the coexistence of opposites, that as Noah indicated, there is chaos and there is order, and their God represented both. And so what they talked about at the very beginning of their understanding of creation was the waters. And there was even the falcon, right, Horus, that floats over the water. And so we see some biblical imagery here. Now, the Egyptian perspective is not biblical, right, because they don't see the water itself, and ultimately Nun, the God who comes out of that, as primarily being orderly or good. They see the water that exists at the start of creation as being chaotic. And so using a compare and contrast between a biblical worldview that talks about the Lord creating the waters and the Spirit hovering over it, and then as the Lord is beginning to create, right? Remember, at the end of every day, he looked upon it and said, "This is good," versus this worldly mindset that sees things as primarily chaotic. How we operate out of life is different, is it not? If you wake up every morning and think this day is going to be chaotic, or you set yourself out with a chaotic mindset, right? The outcomes of that kind of lifestyle will be radically different than seeking a mindset of peace and harmony and goodness. And so just from the very beginnings of Egyptian understanding and mindsets, there is at the back of it kind of this dark and ominous spirit that will lead them. Now we know and we understand and we can discern, biblically speaking, that it is the spirit of this world that is really at play in the midst of Egypt being created. And so we can see why then, if we have, as we talked about, this idea of divine kingship coming into place, and the king being established not just as merely some kind of autocratic ruler, but as God on earth, and so equal and synonymous with all of the gods. And in fact, in some early imagery, right, we see that they were actually, different kings were, in the hieroglyphics and pictures, were demonstrated as being animals. And so that would communicate that they were, that they had the strength of this or the wisdom of that or whatever. And so we see, again, that the mindset in establishing the whole culture was around this whole idea of power. And not just power, but absolute power. That the king is not just merely human, but the king is God represented on earth. And so thinking in those terms, how would we as the followers in that kind of society, how would we operate? Again, it's a little more difficult for us to really fully comprehend that because, as we just studied, we live in a pretty free place. We have the ability to verbalize what we want, when we want. We don't always get the good fruits out of that, but we don't live in a society that a lot of things are forced upon us. And so maybe the closest we can come to really understanding this mindset is having to submit to our parents. But that's even a really poor representation, right? Because I think all of your parents really love you and want the best for you. That was certainly not true of the kings and pharaohs of old. Their whole concept of this life was to establish for themselves as much wealth and power to do what? Then store up for themselves, because they saw that the goal that they had in mind was really for their afterlife. And so being well positioned, they cared very, very, very little about the people around them. And so as we talked about as well, the Nile is extremely significant in that. And so the Nile is like a metaphor that they use for really what life was like, bringing death, and that's through the inundation and the flooding. And so, they began to practice seasonal understandings of when to go to certain areas because it would be flooded, and then when to retreat because the floods would recede. And what happened early on was the rains began to shift and change, and so there was some different atmospherical changes then that caused some of the tribes who were more nomadic to cease and then begin to settle in the Nile Valley. And so as we're going to continue to go through in some of these chapters, we'll talk about how the different cities come to power depending on which king was in rule at the same time. And so, do you guys remember who was the first king of Egypt? Narmer, right. And so we see that he's really the first truly unified king, at least that we can see historically. The first person who unified what started out as 3 different distinct nations that really had sub-nations under it. He was the first one that really unified. And we see at least what the author will say here is that Egyptian history points to them being the first truly true culture that operates around this idea of kingship. And so we know that historically the time frames of that line up, and that we see even our biblical understanding of kings, and that are in part borrowed from some of the nations around them that had kings. Remember, right? The Lord did not establish there to be kingship early on. And it wasn't until the people called for a king that he gave them what they wanted. They got Saul. Ultimately, the Lord in his wisdom, right, was providing for his people an opportunity for them to see what worldly kingship looks like, because he desired to bring true kingship. And so we see in the person of Jesus the only true God on earth, God in the flesh, God with us. And so as we continue to read through here, let's be mindful of the things that are at play here. As far as, and I think you pointed out last week, Noah, that even the author seems to have at least some rudimentary understanding of biblical things, because he's using a lot of, like, the chapter in the beginning, God incarnate, and so he's using language that we would use in Christian circles. So let's jump down then to question 4 is where we left off. Describe what the author means by the unite and rule concept.
Esther can describe that.
No, that's it. I was looking in the book for so long, and I couldn't find where to explain that. So that was going to be my question.
All right. Well, let's talk about it, because I did pull out questions in here intentionally that were going to be like stuff that got glossed over really quick, and it would be really hard to pinpoint in there, because again, the goal of this is not to regurgitate information that we find in the book, but to consider. So Narmer's a good example of this, and some of the other kings that came after them. And so let's imagine, Esther, that you were going to consolidate power and to be the ruler amongst all of us. Okay, so you had it in your mind that, you know what? I deserve to be in charge on Mondays of this group. And so I'm going to set about doing that. And so we have two things that have to play. First is the unite part, and then there's the rule part, right? And so what does it mean to unite?
To come together.
To come together. So how would you unite in this group here? How would you unite us?
Well, I mean, bring us all together.
Right, but how specifically could you do that? Right, because Elijah over here has a different way of looking at things, and I don't know, Elijah. Do you think you want your sister to rule over you? No. So he's not really
Rogue.
He's not really down for that, right? Well, I kind of think you would make a really good leader, and so maybe I'm a little bit more like, yeah, she's younger than me, and I don't want to listen to some whippersnapper, some kid coming up, she doesn't, I have more knowledge. And so I might be more like thinking, well, she would be a good ruler, but I have some issues. Now maybe Kayla over here is like, I really like Esther. She's kind and thoughtful, and I think she'd make a good ruler, and I don't really have any problems with, so I'm more agreeable. So you have all of these different perspectives. And so how do you unite people who have different mindsets? And you guys, it doesn't have to just be Esther that answers this question. I'm putting you on the spot here. And you are asking the same questions, so it's a little unfair for me to press you to give me an answer that you're questioning. But again, how do we come to understand this? How would we do it? Well, how did the Egyptians do it? Well, Narmer, we know for sure that Narmer did one thing, is he used brute force on some people. Some people you have to subjugate. and likely it's the people who are like, nah, who are completely against that idea, right? And so part of uniting people in this sense will be crushing them. And so, because what those people might only understand as power,
That wouldn't
absolutely,
affect-
right. So off with those people's heads. And so if that happens, right? So and this was the first way that they went about it. The first way that we see tribes working together, and this is still true of every historical tribe and power, right? When people were establishing authority and control, they used force to do it.
Are you, in sense, with like how you use Ezra as an example, are you wanting us to answer on how we should do it?
No, I'm
or
saying
as just altogether what you would do?
no. Let's observe what Egypt did, because I think we can all agree that trying to take control of somebody in general by decapitating their family so they'll be fearful, not really God's way of doing things, really. But there is some spiritual things at play here, because what do we understand from a spiritual standpoint? The Bible says, let love be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. We should hate evil, right? So we should seek to decapitate the spirit of unholiness, ungodliness, right? All of those negative spirits that we talk about. We should seek in our lives to eradicate those things. So we can even learn in this sense, how do we operate as true sons? Well, we have to obviously use the power of God, but we're cutting ourselves off, or we're cutting those things out of our lives. And so the first place that they started was they used absolute authority. They fought wars and they won, and it's in Narmer's palette here we see that. That's a good way to come to power. If you know that person has more power than you, and that if you get out of line, there will be not like go to your room, you're in timeout. It's like you're dead. Like that's a whole different dynamic. And again, understanding from a worldly perspective, as he draws axes, from a worldly perspective, right? That's something to be feared. And so the early pharaohs and kings used fear as a way to unite. Now, is that a proper way to unite people? But was it an effective way? It certainly was. In fact, we see that there were the three kingdoms that began, and then they turned into two kingdoms, and that was because one kingdom took control over that other kingdom. And so, the first place that the author talks about uniting is through force. Unity through absolute power and control. And what does that do for the individual who is then God on earth, or becomes God on earth? Well, that controls people's psyches, right? See, the whole concept behind power is not just that somebody can be more powerful than you. Because what do we know to be true? If there's one king who can have power, that also means that there could be somebody else out there who's more powerful. So sheer power or fear is not a way to really control all people, right? Because not all people are motivated that way. So how do you then, if we're still trying to unite people, then if I've already kind of rounded up all of the ruffians, then I need to get in their place that they understand sheer power. What about people who are like, you're not going to intimidate me? So we have to use more than just one way of going about it. And this is why when we're talking about the unite and rule concept, from the king's standpoint, is there had to be multiple things at play that had to take place. It wasn't as simple as just killing all your enemies, although that was a really effective tool back in those days. But what were maybe some other ways? Well, just think about this logically for a second. What are some other ways to try to get people on your side? Bribery? Yeah. You could enrich the lives of certain city-states, right? And so the king could go to a certain area and and with the ruling class there say, you know what, I'm going to take over and I'm going to give you all of this money and you're going to be in charge of this or in charge of that, and here's some wealth to go along with it. Well, there's certain types of people out there that maybe they understand, I'm never going to ascend to the point of having that much power as far as like military authority. I'm not going to be able to take this king on and win, but I could make really good money doing it. Just being involved. Like I'm okay with being 25th in line of power as long as I'm super rich. So yeah, that would be another way. And we see again in Egypt, because of the Nile and the way things were laid out, and the surrounding areas had all of these rich deposits of things, that money was a really, really good way of bringing people in. But let's say now that we have people that they're not really afraid of the king. And, money's not their deal, because that works for some of the ruling class. But you still have a mass of people who will never have money and are never going to be concerned about trying to take control, that you're just casual, everyday followers of whatever is going on. How do we really, convince them? Because that is the general mass of people. And so fear will work in part, but there's got to be more than just fear. Because what we see historically, right, is that if people are subjugated long enough, they will rise up. And we'll actually see that in Egypt. We'll see some of that at play. So we've got to also consider that, as true with the enemy's tactics and a worldly point of view, that not everything that comes from a worldly point of view is just overtly negative or unrighteous. When Satan is talked about in the Bible, he says he disguises himself as what? An angel of light. And so what are some good components of the Egyptian culture? And again, thinking of the tactics of the enemy, there's going to be some really benevolent things that the kings do to consolidate power. They're not going to just be purely evil. In fact, the most dangerous kings and leaders historically have not started out 100% evil. Think about people like Hitler. How did Hitler ever come to power? It didn't start with, I'm going to kill a bunch of Jews and I'm going to eradicate all of this. It started by appealing to certain things in people, and it was a slow creep towards his original intention was to form an Aryan nation of pure-blooded people. But he didn't let that secret out of the bag until he had a whole bunch of people convinced. He let that secret out with his close circle, but he got people that would never say anything otherwise invested in it. In fact, we have the saying about how, in order for evil or evil men to come to power, it takes good people doing nothing. So people being apathetic. So maybe what are some of the things that we could look at from the Egyptian standpoint that was good that they did? Because part of uniting has to be rallying people around something that's healthy or good as well.
Well, they made some pretty crazy improvements on construction, and just I don't know too much specific, but they made some huge improvements on ancient technology, which then spread across the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a good thing, and definitely a good thing that Egypt provided or gave, that sprouted from Egypt.
Yeah, so we can see maybe the king, and again, it's never benevolent. The king is never doing it, at least from an Egyptian perspective, for the good of the people. Everything he's doing is to consolidate power. So making improvements in their roadways, in the way that they store up their foods. And in fact, one of the things that they did really well, that Narmer did, was having divided kingdoms, was identifying certain cities there as being set apart or really good, or giving that city preeminence over that area. And so now it's not just that section, but we're saying that city, wow, look at all the amazing things that are coming out of there. And I'm going to, as king, as God on earth, I'm going to recognize that that is a holy place, a place to be set apart. Well, that would appeal to people from that region, right? And so he begins to seek out and give perspective of an encouragement to all of the different belief systems, because again, we see that Egypt was originally three, but it melded into two. There was Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And so in Upper Egypt, he's kind of pumping them up and saying, look at all these great things about Upper Egypt. It's amazing. Look at the art. Look at this. And this city is set apart. Well, Lower Egypt, wow, you guys have this and that. And so the king uses a certain measure of charisma and didn't have to be genuine at all, did it? He just had to make people feel good. And you know what? If we could take this, all of the great parts about Upper Egypt and all these great parts about Lower Egypt, and we can work together and we can make trade together and we can really rule this thing well together. And that's the language of ungodly kings, right? Is again, the goal is just to unite, bring people together. But for what end? For the pharaohs and kings of old, the purpose of uniting was to consolidate their power. Because again, going back to, and why it's so important for us to understand the earliest mindset of Egyptians is if the kings were gods on earth, that they were trying to live up to that standard. So the more wealth they could accumulate, the more people that they could subjugate and put under their rule, the more they could expand their borders. All of those things illuminated how great of a king that was. So we have, in our modern times, we have one king of Egypt that generally everyone knows about. He was a young king, but we have a lot of his riches. Do you guys remember who that is? Or have you ever heard of? See if you can take a guess.
King Tut.
King Tut. Probably the most well-known king. But what we know historically now is not a super significant king historically. But because we see all of his wealth, because we were unable to unearth this tomb of grand riches, in our even to our modern mind, that King Tut is exactly what the goal of the pharaohs was to be remembered for their power. Well, only because we can find those things. But we look at kings like Ramses and Sneferu and all of these other kings that built these great pyramids and things like that, and they're remembered, right? Thousands upon thousands of years ago. And as Elijah pointed out, like trying to figure out how did they even build the pyramids.
They had slaves.
It's crazy. It's crazy to think about how they operated on that level that long ago. And what that points to is there was a tremendous amount of power or control. Because what we know to be true is, in order to build the pyramids, and I would say likely it's not aliens, likely it's not giants, likely it was on the backs of everyday people. But we see, even I think they allude to it in some of these chapters that are to come, the level to which they would have to place these large stones is just like a regular, like 24/7 over like 20-year span. And so that would mean, in order to build those things, you had to have a tremendous amount of influence. And that influence can't just be sheer power, sheer raw strength. So power has to take on more than just militaristic might. An effective leader to come to control over all of that area had to have military might, had to be tactical enough to understand where to fight, how to fight, or surround himself with really good generals who knew where to fight and how to fight. And so he would have to win those generals onto his side, right? Have to make sure that they're super loyal. So as a king, I'm going to find somebody who likes me, who has some real giftings and real strengths. But more than that, I'm going to have to find a bunch of riches too. I'm going to have to make sure that I'm filling my coffers a lot, but that I'm also putting enough of it out there to the right peoples so that they can control things as well. And this is where the Nile comes in handy, as we talked about transport, communication, all of those things. If I can control the Nile, and remember the map of Egypt, they saw it upside down. So what was south to us was really what they thought of was northern or upper Egypt. And so if they can control that region where the waters come from, and remember, their mindset was that the waters just rise from the ground, and getting back to what Noah was talking about, this belief that there is chaos and order. Well, if I can harness chaos, if the follower's mindset is chaos is what is the ruling thing, but the king has control over chaos, that makes him benevolent and fearful. If the king takes ownership for if I'm doing well, we're going to have a good flood season, which is going to provide us food and grain, right? And the king is looked at as being benevolent. It doesn't matter whether that was true or not. And so the king has a great ability now, just from a communication standpoint. And then we see things like this, right? The Narmer Palette, which is like, we have the same things today, right? We have media, Facebook, Instagram, all of this stuff that how do you manage that? So for those of you who use social media, do you often put on social media like when you are not looking so good, you're just like, look at me today, I'm a train wreck. Or these are the worst things about me, and you're promoting that? Or do people generally, as a rule, try to paint themselves in the best light? Pretty worldly people on all of these sites put themselves out there as if they were wise and insightful and they had their lives together. And there's many people that worship at the altar of these kings, or worldly kings and queens. Right? We're trying to keep up with a certain groups of people that are not coming from a very godly place. In fact, sadly, what has infiltrated a lot of the modern idea of Christianity or churches is praise of pastors and people and building them up on pedestals. And so we can see how this whole mindset of keeping control and power has infiltrated even into the church. And so, again, as we're studying history here, we have to understand this perspective of we want to be aware of the schemes of the enemy. Right? The Bible talks about faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kiss of the enemy is deceitful. There's a great spirit that is at work even in our midst, and it started here in Egypt, that the kings of old would be your enemies and would be lavishing kisses upon you and ready to stab you in the back at any given moment. And so how does this play out for us, culturally speaking? Because it's easy for us to say, well, I don't have that mindset, or I don't like that mindset, or again, portraying things like this. The Egyptian is just, worldliness is just this, it's all a negative thing. But again, if we understand and discern rightly that the enemy of your soul does not come, right, he's not some guy that's in a red suit with pointy red ears and has a pitchfork and has got, a little tail. That's not the devil. Lucifer is an angel of light. So he comes offering us what? Enough truth that's intermingled with all sorts of deception. Think of Adam and Eve. How did he deceive them? I mean, think about this. And this ties into the unite and rule concept, because the enemy of this world, right? That Satan got control of this world by doing what? Uniting Adam and Eve and then ruling over them. And Adam and Eve had what? Everything. All of it. There's just one mistake they could make. And what was the appeal that the serpent made to Adam and Eve?
That you'll be like God.
Did God really say that?
You're already made in his image, though.
Well, right. Well, think about that. We're created in God's image. We're already exactly who God designed for us to be. We had the whole world, all of the opportunity, all of the fellowship with the Father. And what Satan did was he got us to doubt who we are as a people. Did God really say? Well, God knows. God knows that if you eat that fruit, he knows that you are going to be like him. We already were. We're created in his image. He united mankind against the very power that created them, that loved them, that is truly benevolent. See, Satan comes disguised as one who is trying. Did God really do that to you? Man, I can't believe he's like that. He's just holding out on you. Now again, the tendency for us to interpret through the lens of our life is to only assume evil as being 100% evil. And yet if we're not careful, we allow these same ways of being controlled to infiltrate our lives. We've talked about this before, and I'll say it again. What you consume from a social media, whether you're reading, whatever you're doing, whatever standpoint, what you consume is what controls you. You give power to that which you prescribe to. And this is difficult, right? At your generation, because it's easy to be consumed with things that maybe are not always from the Lord. And what I continue to hear being spoken over this generation is it sounds like God is kind of calling you guys to task, is he not? That there's a deeper thing that the Lord is trying to call you in. And that comes at a great price, because the question you have to ask yourself is who am I going to follow? Well, there is a spirit, in a sense, of Egypt, of this way, that is really deceptive. And what would likely happen to many of them in those days would be people who weren't necessarily affected would still go, well, all of this other people around me are doing this and submitting to this king, and who am I to rise up? And so I'm just going to go along with it because it's what's easy. Yeah, go ahead.
It's the way of life that they were born into.
Right. It's the mindset that they came out of. We were born out of chaos. We were created for chaos and order. That doesn't make sense. But the way that they've communicated is that these things coexist. And I, as the king, have power to bring order and the power to bring chaos, because I am God on earth. And when there is chaos, they could simply just say, when things aren't going well, they could say, well, you have angered me, and that's why nothing is good for you. That's why I've caused the Nile to recede, and I've caused a drought in the land. Because he isn't going to be affected. Why? Because his grains are stored up. The king is in good shape, regardless of what happens around them. So again, how do we contend with this mindset? And I want to bring this to a more personal application, because I think as I'm observing what is going on in our midst, I'm observant of this very fact. It's not just happening in your generation, but to all of us as a people. Is how do we operate? Do we operate from a mindset of what is easy and comfortable and secular first? Or is the Lord truly the culture of God's house, the culture of my heart and mind and my convictions? Is it built truly around the Father and around the pursuits? And again, I want to ask you this, in our communications one with another, do our communications become very familiar really quickly? And again, there's nothing wrong with relating to one another in everyday life and talking about the good things, the bad things, these cool shoes, that great book. All of those things can be healthy as long as they're centered around what is truly right and righteous. In a lot of ways, the choice is, will we conform to the idea that we were created for chaos? And if that's true, right, nothing really matters. What I pursue is irrelevant. I can do anything I want and it'll be all right. And there's not really any truly moral thing to hold myself to. There's not any real true standard, because there's no real standard in chaos. And sure, there's going to be some order that comes out of that chaos. That chaos is just, it's bound to produce something good. It's like the modern equivalent to that would be people who think that the earth was created by a big bang, right? Like everything exploded, and when it exploded, everything came together perfectly. Well, that's not logical at all, right? Because if you take something and you put a bunch of TNT into a car and you set the fuse and it explodes, it's not going to reassemble itself back or make itself better than what it was. So we either have that mindset, or we have a mindset that what we were created from was good, And what we were created for was to be in the image of what is truly good. Well, that shifts the way that we will ultimately live that out. And again, it's easy to have conversations along these lines. And you guys, this is not new information for anyone. But how does it truly impact us? That's the question. You see, the way that the Egyptians walked that out was that it became a very domineering society of fear and worry and dread. And for the vast majority of people who had no wealth or no position or no connections, their life was literally backbreaking work, sickness. And what did it matter to the Pharaoh if one of the millions of people that were building his pyramids died or his wife miscarried?
At least it wasn't me.
Well, he has no care beyond what? Beyond building himself an afterlife of comfort. See, everything for the king was consolidating power. Now, we have just a few minutes here, 10 minutes left. We'll get to this. Really sets the stage, which I think is the most important question out of all of these. Is number 5. He said that the tomb was the essential guarantor of kingship. Explain. Why to the ancient Egyptian mindset was the tomb so significant?
Because they needed to have a good afterlife.
Yeah.
The tomb itself.
Yeah. Yeah, it was certainly to provide a better afterlife.
Sorry, for some reason I was thinking casket.
Well, the sarcophagus even could be pretty significant, even in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, since the king was living to gain all this power in Egyptian culture, all that power pretty much mattered in the afterlife, and that was what a lot of it was basically for. So your afterlife represented how good of a king you are, and it represented who you are in the afterlife. So the tomb, things that were in it, sacrifices, the riches, the honor that was brought in from who the king was, all mattered in the afterlife. So the tomb, in a sense, was where all that was stored, and was one of the most important places for the king to be, because that's where he rested to go into the afterlife.
The bigger the pyramid, the more power you could demonstrate. And we see that mindset then changes, because we have then a mindset that shifts, as we're going to talk about here in the next few weeks. Going from pyramids, that's not the way we communicate real power. The real power is going to be how we create temples. Well, that's not the way that we demonstrate power. It's going to be through this or through that. And so, what the tomb presented for everyone who would follow after was the greatness of the king.
I think another important aspect of that is, if you think of divine kingship, one of the most important features of divinity is immortality.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tomb itself was, in a sense, that an assurance of that immortality. So obviously the kings themselves were human beings, so they weren't physically immortal in that sense, but as an idea, or as a memory, or as a pillar in their culture, they can remain, in a sense, immortal. So that was what guaranteed kingship through those burials and those tombs, was to it was to serve as a perpetual remembrance of this assumably apparently divine person. So I think immortality is a very important aspect to consider when looking at the tomb as a guarantor of kingship.
Absolutely. It's an excellent point. Yeah, that he lives we're talking about today. These kings of old.
In part, they're successful because we're talking about that.
That's right. And so let's close with this. If that is true, if the tomb is the essential guarantor of kingship, in the worldly ways that we see in Egypt, was to accumulate, and that the king was laid in a tomb that is accumulated, let's juxtapose that with Jesus, because we talk a lot about Jesus' tomb. And what is radically different about Jesus' tomb than about the tombs of the kings of old?
He didn't leave something behind to show how great he was.
The tomb was empty.
Actually, that is what he did, but he
Yeah.
rose from the tomb. That's
Right.
what he left
And think about the significance of that and how the juxtaposition of the worldly mindset of accumulation versus, I mean, Jesus models for it. It's like we all know, right? Well, you can accumulate it all. You can't take it with you when you go. Like we say that tongue in cheek, but there's a deeper spiritual reality. Yes, Jesus' tomb was empty. The empty tomb speaks volumes over the greatest sarcophagus in King Tut, the greatest pyramids of Giza, the empty tomb. Why? Yes, because Jesus is risen. See, all of those other tombs were stuffed with things, and what we can find is even, old skeletal remains or pieces of decomposed bodies. What we don't find in Jesus' tomb is him. So why is that significant? Again, getting back to this mindset of how we come about understanding history or understanding any true study is that we have to filter it through a biblical narrative, an understanding of what the Father is trying to get us to see and to understand. For me, this popped out. That, in particular, the tomb is the essential guarantor of kingship, was highlighted immediately by the Spirit. To say, what does that say of Jesus? And if Jesus was king represented on this earth, and that we are to be like him, right, because we are sons of God, then what does that mean for us practically? We can either have a worldly mindset of accumulation of knowledge, accumulation of power, accumulation of things, accumulation of whatever, or we can look at the tomb of Jesus, which there was nothing left, and then discern Jesus' life. Jesus' life was not about accumulating any of those things, but about living as a standard in the midst of this earth. Both worldviews are concerned with the afterlife. One is concerned with doing enough good things or having enough now to promote itself in the hereafter. The other is about serving, right? Honoring,
Another way
modeling.
you could look at the king would be, compared to Jesus, would be the kings came and wanted everything, but Jesus came with nothing
Mm-hmm.
and left with nothing.
Mhm.
And they were born into everything and left with everything.
Mm-hmm.
Or tried
Well,
to anyways.
he had certainly nothing of this world. Jesus came to offer us a way. Jesus said this, and we'll close it here. What does it profit, right? If somebody gains the whole world and forfeits their soul, what profit is that? What good is it to accumulate all of the world, to have all of these things? And again, it's not just possessions. It's the way we think. It's the knowledge we hold. It's in the relationships we have. See, Jesus is pointing us to a better way, right? We know this. But again, my question is how are we going to live this out? Because if we're not careful, we will follow the spirit of the world, the spirit of Egypt, of how we operate, how we try to position ourselves to be looked at in a certain way, to have power or control in a certain way, to accumulate, to have riches, to have better things than other people, instead of emptying ourselves. Jesus, the Bible talks about, it's called kenosis in Philippians, where he talks about how he emptied himself. He emptied himself of all of his divine rights. That is a different perspective. Jesus was 100% God, 100% man. He emptied himself of the right while he was on this earth. He humbled himself. How much more so as followers of the Lord? Should we be humble in the way that we approach things, emptying ourselves of the desire for position or control or power? And again, you guys, I think this is a really important thing to highlight, because I think our tendency, if we're not careful, is to slide into familiar patterns of life. And I want to encourage you and admonish you. I believe the Lord is really after something in your guys' generation, which means, quite honestly, that you are going to have to give up some of the comforts. You're going to have to do difficult things. Jesus was led into the wilderness by the Spirit. The Israelites went through the wilderness because of their disobedience. Jesus went into the wilderness with obedience. The Israelites took 40 years to get through it. For Jesus, it was 40 days. And so, obedience to the pattern of life that the Lord offers us, it is difficult, because the wilderness is not an easy place, but it will produce the good fruit. And likely, we won't have to linger there. Disobedience will cause us to linger. And so, how do we, as God's people, as sons, relate to one another? And that is the fundamental question that we come back to every week. How are you going to engage? Not just in what is easy and what is comfortable, and consolidating, more even peace in your life, or ease. But what is of great benefit to you? What is the Lord leading you today to cut off and to pursue? And that will be kind of the question as we continue to go through, because ultimately we learn about Egypt to get to the point where God is pulling his people out of Egypt. But the point of Exodus is not to get God's people out of Egypt. The Exodus is to get Egypt out of God's people. And so with that, Naomi, you want to close in prayer? Please.
Yes, Lord, I just thank you, Lord, for just your purpose for your people, and or even through the very beginning. Lord, I pray that we would just look back and learn, Lord, what you were trying to show us, and even the perspectives and the ways of the people before us, Lord, that we could learn and do better, Lord, in order to, Lord, live out your will and your purpose that you have planted in each one of your people. I pray that you would just bless each one here and each one who listens, Lord, to these teachings, Lord, that Lord, we would just live out your life and love your people, and that we would, Lord, follow you, Lord, in your way. Lord, I thank you for Justin, Lord, and his heart, Lord, just to teach your ways, Lord, to us and to the people willing to listen and learn. Lord, I pray that we would continue to, Lord, bless him and, Lord, just his heart to be a blessing to us, Lord, that you would continue to fill him with your wisdom and your love. Lord, I thank you for your purpose in these teachings and these times, Lord, that you would continually bless them. And I pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.